late. Excellent. All right. Anybody experiencing any problems? All right. I'm going to start presenting myself. My name is Maria Kvilhaug. The people who watch this are probably aware of that because you are already my patrons. Thank you for being my patrons. It's very helpful and it allows me to continue doing the work that you evidently like that I'm doing. Well, the camera there is not the best, so right, I'm gonna just start reading for about what we say, about 1 hour. I'm gonna read, then I'm gonna have a look. I have 2 hours. I have to stop at 9 sharp, so I'm gonna read for 1 hour and then I'm gonna check if there are any questions. If there are few questions, I will continue reading, and if there are any well, if there are a lot of questions, I'll spend that last hour trying to reply to that, and I will ask you to try to keep the questions about what I've been reading today, because we will get through the whole book and there will be a chance to discuss other topics later. If you want to ask anything else about from me, then well, you can give it a try and I'll see if I can answer it. So I'm just gonna start. I can't really see yet if there are any. Look, there seems to be some. Okay, hello, thank you for being here. I hope there is no technical trouble getting through this. It looks all right. So I'm gonna start. I'm gonna put on my reading glasses, and I'm gonna read from this book, The Seed of Yggdrasill. As you all may know, this is the latest published book by the three little sisters. I'm going to leave this here because I am more accustomed to reading from the other book, the one, well, this is the Heritage edition. It's easier for me to read it because I read it before. So excuse me. The light here is terrible, but I'm not gonna need light to read. So right. Okay, I was thinking perhaps to read the introduction, but then I thought that it's a very old introduction. I might have wanted to read that introduction. Well, I might have wanted to write that introduction a little bit differently, but I'm gonna read a little from it, and I'm gonna begin with a reading from the Håvamål, the Poetic Edda, Håvamål, stanza 142 in Old Norse and then in my English translation. Runar muntu finna och rådna stafi. Mjög stora stafi, mjök stinna stafi, fådig fimbulthuler, och gordo ginregin, och reist roptr ragna. Runes you must find, and the rune that is grasped, the very great rune, the very powerful rune, which is colored by the great sage, and made by the sacred powers, and carved by the shattered one among the gods. So this is the introduction. In the autumn of 1996, I left Norway, where I had been studying world history and philosophy at the University of Oslo, and moved to England to study art instead. I was 21 years old, and it was there, in my exile, that I first stumbled upon a copy of the Poetic Edda, translated into English. Of course, I knew about the book. After all, the Poetic Edda is a collection of the mythical and legendary lore of my ancestors. The Vikings, I wrote there. I would probably have written that differently, but it is a part of my cultural heritage. The part, I grew up with it. It was something we learned about in school. It was something we had at home. It was something my grandfather, at least, he used to recite from it, and yeah. So, however, I wrote, this lore had been transmitted to us through our educational system in a simplified and summarized form, often with an attitude that was both condescending and apologetic towards a mythical lore that was considered the result of superstitious beliefs and pagan idolatry. And well, this was in the 80s when I grew up. That was sort of how the impression that they left with me when I learned about it in school. But I learned about it in school, and that was a good thing. So, but as a result, I held much the same attitude towards the Vikings. Did I really write the Vikings? Well, today I would say the Old Norse pre-Christian culture of Scandinavia during the Viking Age. But anyway, as a result, I held much the same attitude towards the Vikings and their lore that I had encountered both at home and abroad. That the Vikings were most famous for their ships, their sagas about family feuds and wars, and especially for their brutal pillaging of foreign shores between the 8th and the 10th centuries. Although there are those who indulge in idealized fantasies about such stereotypes, most people, whether living during the Viking Age or today, would regard this raping and pillaging trait as that of a bunch of primitive and cruel bullies. Let me be the first to state that I have absolutely no political agenda or any need to glorify and idealize the Viking Age culture, and particularly not the brutality of Viking raids. And I still remember the somewhat embarrassed grins of our teachers in school whenever we were to read something written by Old Norse writers. A sort of apologetic approach regarding the alien worldviews of our Viking ancestors. On one hand, the Vikings were quite cool and their stories highly entertaining. On the other hand, their attitudes towards life, death and good living appears in stark contrast to the values of modern Norwegian society, a contrast which renders it almost impossible to recognize the wisdom of the opposite side without being extreme. So, as a result, we fail to learn from our ancestors, thinking that we either have to idealize everything they did or else ignore their wisdom altogether. So we have much to learn from them if we can apply discernment and recognize complexity. So I'm gonna skip past a little bit here. As I began reading the Edda, I quickly found that there was a lot more to these people and their culture than modern stereotypes allow for, and that their sacred lore, some of which has luckily been left to us, is worthy of general attention, not only from their descendant cultures in Scandinavia, but it ought to be recognized as a part of the pan-human World Heritage treasure chest, I think. There is a reason why Tolkien based himself so closely on Norse myth and legends when he wrote The Lord of the Rings. And there was a reason why Shakespeare adapted an old Danish legend written down by Saxo some 350 years before Shakespeare was born, when he wrote his famous play Hamlet. Because Hamlet is based on an Old Norse saga that has only been survived in a Latin work by Saxo. So the reason is that the Norse literary material is a treasure chest of great stories of significance to all human beings, regardless of culture. When I began inquiring into the more esoteric aspects of the Viking Age, I realized that despite the fact that Viking Age culture was the culture of our own direct ancestors, now I'm talking about Scandinavian cultures, we do have a lot of bonds back to that culture still. But even so, I had learned a lot more about ancient Greek religion and philosophy. I had learned more about biblical myth and church history than I ever learned about Old Norse mythology. So my culturally based concept of Old Norse myths was as stereotyped as it usually is, a collection of funny tales, some instances of practical life wisdom, and a lot of superstitious beliefs. Through schooling, I had been conditioned to think that the Old Norse pagan religion was void of spiritual depth, and thus supposedly the reason why conversion to Christianity finally happened during the 11th century AD. And I certainly did not think that there would be any evidence for rational observation of natural phenomena combined with logical deductions within the myths. In school, we had read some extracts and summaries of certain myths of the Snorri's Edda, as well as several sagas, and we had learned some rudimentary Old Norse grammar and read through some Old Norse texts. However, no one could really accuse us of knowing the language and sacred lore of our ancestors very well, apart from some stereotyped notions about Thor, the Thundergod, Odin, king of the gods, and Freya, goddess of love. So my first encounter with the real Edda lore was a rather magical experience. When I first sat down and read a translated copy of the Poetic Edda, it was as if ancient and forgotten powers were trying to reach out to me through the words of poetry. And I even began dreaming about them, yet I could not grasp what they were trying to say. It immediately struck me that something must have been lost in translation. Not because the translator was bad. In any case, I was in no position at all to determine the quality of a translation from the Old Norse language, but because of the names of characters, things, and places were not translated, usually. In modern languages, names usually have an original meaning. Perhaps people in the past placed more emphasis on these names and their meanings. So to figure out the real meaning of the stories became quite an obsession for me, like a vocation that I had to follow. The characters of the myths, even began appearing as powerful characters in my dreams, seemingly urging me on. I had only rudimentary lessons in Old Norse at high school, but armed with a pile of dictionaries, some dating back to 1886, and with copies of the poetic and prose Eddas in the original language, I sat down. I was like 21, and I sat down for a whole summer at the University Library of Oslo for 2 months during my 1997 summer holiday, with the purpose of translating the mythical names. Some of my translations at the time may have been questionable. Hi, Laura. Nice. It's nice that I know that someone is listening. Well, okay, sorry. I'm going to go back to reading. So yeah, I admit that some of my translations at the time may have been questionable, or at least open for different interpretations. But they nevertheless provided me with a key to unlock the hidden messages of the myths. Apparently, simple stories about heroes battling giants suddenly became spiritual allegories. Or parables on the importance of overcoming hatred, fear, and greed. Because the names of the hostile giants that these heroes were fighting, they began to reveal their true meanings. So when one realizes that a Viking prince has to fight a giant called hatred, another called rage, and must be reborn in order to win a battle that he lost in his previous life, the battle of the Rock of Greed, in order to restore the peace of wisdom and gain entry into a divine afterlife. What at first sight appeared to be just another heroic legend of a tough guy who fights giants, well, it became a spiritual parable. So, in fact, the moment I started to apply my translated names to the old texts, a whole new world unraveled itself, a world of spiritual concerns, ageless wisdom, and metaphysical and philosophical speculation. Speculation that is sometimes almost compatible with modern scientific theories. Hello, Eric. Good morning. Oh, I'm so happy to see someone here. Yeah. Okay, I'll continue reading. So, it should be needless to point out, but it is needed anyway. People in the olden days were no less intelligent than modern people. And they were just as capable of making rational observations and logical conclusions as we are. And some of them are probably not, as many among us are not. Anyway, so even though their technical equipment for making experiments may have been less advanced, they were still capable in their minds. So rather than basing themselves on technology, they employed different aspects of their brains. I assume they employed techniques such as meditation and altered states of consciousness, states in which a human being may intuitively grasp the unknown as an equally real and valid approach to understanding reality. They lived in an animated universe where the sun, the earth, the moon were living beings. And where there was a spiritual purpose to existence, a basic and fluid attitude that would seem unscientific to modern rationalists, but which nevertheless made sense to them, and which certainly also makes sense to many moderns. A spiritual and animistic approach to existence and to learning is not necessarily a sign of ignorance or intellectual limitation. Rather, it seems that their approach to reality was a matter of balancing the two parts of our brains, not censoring out the one in favor of the other, like we are prone to do today. Now, I look at this, and I wrote this almost 10 years ago, or more than 10 years ago, and yeah, well, as I said, there might be some parts of this introduction especially that I would have done differently today. Anyway, no real scientific breakthrough has ever come by using the rational mind alone, as Albert Einstein said himself. He said, "The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society which honors the servant, the rational mind, and has forgotten the gift." So, the intuitive mind is the gift. Einstein's theory of relativity would never have been discovered and carefully investigated without the initial inspirational revelation. Amen to that. I also began working on this because of some intuitive understanding, I think. Anyway, when I see what the Old Norse myth makers have made out of their insights into the early universe, and even before the earth was created, I see a lore that is the result of such revelations, described with the language and the concepts that they had to hand. Even if it is not always accurate from a modern point of view, there is no superstition in their view on the nature of the universe. It is rather the result of sincere metaphysical speculation, or what we today might call natural philosophy. When such philosophy is presented through the allegorical language of myth and poetry, it is not always just mythology. Rather, it is the application of a symbolical language appearing as mythology, which in reality is trying to reveal deep thoughts and often real insights. I could also begin to perceive likenesses between the underlying messages of Old Norse myths with several other world heritage spiritual traditions. For example, with shamanism. Well, today I wouldn't have used that term so easily, but I did that back then because it was common. It's for more than a century, the term shamanism has been used as an umbrella term for seemingly similar practices in many different cultures. So I used that term without any criticism back then. So anyway, we find similarities, likenesses between the underlying messages of Old Norse myth with several other world heritage spiritual traditions, with shamanism, with various Hindu and Buddhist traditions such as Tantra and Bhakti. Bhakti is a devotional trend where myths and gods were used, and we know this for certain, they were used as symbols and parables. I also saw similarities to the Vedic texts that preceded these Tantra and Bhakti traditions, and with various classical philosophical spiritual traditions such as Neoplatonism, mysticism, and particularly with the ancient mystery schools that most Greek philosophers, including Socrates and Plato, were actually initiated into. These schools taught mythology and symbols as allegories for the human soul on its quest towards wholeness, its return to true identity, to true divinity and union with the universal soul. After translating those texts, I was certain, but I quickly perceived that the same was the case with Norse myths. They are allegories, and they were ultimately designed to take the initiate on a journey towards not only knowledge about the universe and worldly wisdom, but also towards wholeness and an awakening of the divine soul within. I was hooked. So although I was actually studying art at the time, studying the Old Norse myths became a time-consuming hobby that eventually led me to return to university studies on the subjects of Old Norse philology and the history of religions. In the spring of 2004, I graduated with a master's degree in cultural studies, the history of religions, at the University of Oslo, Norway, with the thesis, The Maiden with the Mead, a goddess of initiation rituals in Old Norse myths. So in that dissertation, I explored how the fundamental thematic structure of several Edda poems perfectly rendered the structures and themes of what could only be explained as a pagan initiation ritual, and that the descriptions of this fundamental and that the descriptions of this fundamental ritual, although in the language of symbols, was a credible and accurate and amazingly detailed description of such a ritual. The ritual is structurally similar to typical shamanistic initiation rites, as well as being both structurally and thematically similar to the initiation rituals of classical mystery religions, such as that described by Apuleius in his Isis book, in his 180 before Christ novel Metamorphosis, also, or better known as the Golden Ass. That would be the donkey ass, not the other ass. Such a discovery challenges any notion held by some critics that the Old Norse myths simply reflect the time in which they were written down, which was well after Christianity was introduced. The discovery of the ritual structure of the myths and the detailed accounts of the various stages of the ritual experience strongly suggests that the myths, as they have been left to us, do in fact reflect, to a considerable degree at least, pagan religion and pagan religious practices, despite them having been written down by Christian scribes and scholars. Since then, although I have not pursued a further academic career beyond a master degree, I have continued researching the essential meaning of Norse myths, taking very seriously the idea that the myth makers, the poets, the skalds, actually tried to convey meaning through metaphor. I also take the essential idea seriously that the names of characters and places in the myths actually mean something. Meanings that are vital if one is to understand the messages of the metaphors. So by March 2010, after about 6 years of doing research on the side, building upon my first thesis, The Maiden with the Mead, I was almost brimming over with material about the Old Norse myths, and I felt deeply compelled to share my insights. So I created my first YouTube channel and began making videos about ancient goddess symbolism and Norse mythology. By the end of the summer that year, I sat down and presented my first lecture on how the Norse myth may be deciphered. I called my lecture series Hidden Knowledge in Old Norse Myths, and little more than a year and a half after, I had filmed 30 lectures as well as 10 slideshows with music videos retelling and analysing Norse myths. I have also written several articles. The feedback and the interest that keeps flooding in, particularly about my talking videos, has truly warmed my heart and propelled further investigations. The thing that never ceases to amaze me after 16 years, I wrote this back in 2012, so now it's even more years and it's still the same. The thing that never ceases to amaze me after let's see if I began in... Well, after 16 years of research into these riddles that are the myths, is that they never cease to reveal something new. And as I teach, I learn. And this is still the case. I still learn. There is so much. So, let's see. Definite answers, the eyes that see. I cannot pretend to have definite answers to how all Norse myths ought to be analysed, but I can certainly make many educated arguments. My analyses are based on the basic rules of Old Norse poetical metaphors and parables, and upon my philological interpretation of mythical names. By philology is basically the study of ancient languages that are not spoken anymore. Some Icelanders would argue that they are still speaking more or less the same, but even that language has changed, especially the way things were perceived. So the real Icelandic today is, of course, the closest thing you get to Old Norse or Old Nordic languages. It's very close. I'll admit that they can probably easily sit down and read in this Old Norse language more easily than I could, because their language is more similar than modern Norwegian is. But people thought differently 1,000 years back, and they probably spoke a bit differently too, and used different references than now. So anyway. My analyses are based on the basic rules of Old Norse poetical metaphors and parables, and upon my philological interpretations of mythical names. As to meaning, I am convinced that there are several layers to most of the myths. For the most part, I focus on the layers that I believe relate to ritual and to spiritual maturing and evolution on a personal and societal level, as well as those myths which appear to convey metaphysical speculation and natural philosophy. There may be other aspects of the myths that can only be understood from mathematical or numerical and astronomical code language or similar, but they are areas of studies that I cannot pretend to master. So, for the reader with such interests, I believe that the translations, associations, and cultural information offered in this book may help you on the way to further investigation. The reader may notice that I have offered extensive and detailed analysis of certain myths and Edda stanzas, whereas I have left others quite open for interpretation, offering little more than translations and comparisons that may help the reader to make up their own mind. Whenever I offer a full analysis, I do so because I have worked on such an analysis. Okay, I'll start that sentence again. Whenever I offer a full analysis, I do so because I have worked on such an analysis for years, and am certain that my interpretations are based on sound arguments, and that they make sense within a wider frame of understanding, and within the layer of meaning that I am addressing. And that does not mean that nothing may be added to or changed, or that other layers of meaning do not exist. This is not a book of definite answers, but rather an attempt to offer a basic key to deciphering the riddles proposed in Old Norse myths, showing how the key may open up doors to understanding. There is no such thing as objective research, since we are all subjective individuals who, whether consciously or unconsciously, always draw on our own experiences and previous knowledge and particular areas of interest when we are trying to study human culture. We will be closer to objectivity if we can recognize and be conscious about our inherent subjectivity. I repeat, we will be closer to objectivity if we can recognize and be conscious about our inherent subjectivity. That's as close to objectivity as we get, to be aware, to be conscious about it, that we are in fact all subjective, no matter who we are really. We will always base our understanding on our own experience. So I will be seeing things in the myths that others have overlooked because of my particular life experience, my cultural background, and even my gender will form how I look at it. Others will be seeing other things. I am certain that I have overlooked many clues. At the time of writing, it is my experience that the myths are incredibly profound, continuously revealing aspects of themselves and ever unfolding so that one may actually never reach a definite answer. That's the that's the best thing about it, I think. In some cases, I may have personal opinions as to the meanings of myths, yet I will still hold these back because I have not yet arrived at a truly scientifically sound argument. In some cases, I simply cannot provide any interpretation, or at least not a complete interpretation. I have done my best to offer translations and significant associations, leaving it up to the reader to contemplate the meaning. I hope you will enjoy this book. Till års och frider, for a good year and peace, which is an Old Norse prayer, actually. So, notes. Translation. The translations of Edda poems in this book are my own, as are any possible errors or misinterpretations. I am aware that I sometimes choose unusual interpretations and that my translations may thus differ somewhat from others sometimes. Translations of ancient text is always a matter of interpretation, and even when a literal translation is possible to make, there may be alternative options of interpretations. I have noticed that quite often, even the most sincere and scientific interpreters refrain from translating an ancient text literally, choosing a paraphrase instead, because the literal translation sounds so awkward and incomprehensible in the modern language that a translator will have to change the text in order to make it more accessible to a general modern public, and thus original meanings may easily be lost in translation. I have attempted to translate the text as literally as possible, yet at the same time choosing to build the sentences in a way which sounds as poetically beautiful and rhythmical in English as it does in Old Norse. I tried my best anyway. I always present the Old Norse original text next to my translations so that those who study the language may see my reasoning. Even when the literal rendering may appear incomprehensible to moderns, I have tried to show through further analysis why and how they still make sense within their own cultural and spiritual context. So, here are notes about the translations I have used, and I think I'll just skip that for now. Spelling, pronunciation, or Norse terms. I'm gonna skip to the actual book. Chapter 1. The Books of Old. Our source to Old Norse pagan beliefs. Odin kvað, rådom kver lodd fafnir, en du råd nemer, njota mundu eftu nemer, der muno god du geter, at hårom thul le du aldrig i, opp der godt, datter gamler kveda. Opt or skarpom belg, skilin ord koma, deimer hanger med ham, og skoller med skram. And that means, Odin spoke, I advise you, Lodfafnir. At this point, I interpreted the term Lod, because Lod, in my Old Norse dictionary, Lod means a voluptuous woman, a woman who's a bit round. And Fafnir means embracer. So I advise you, embracer of the voluptuous woman. And that could very well be a kidding for the earth, actually, the earth goddess. Because I knew that the earth was round. So, anyway, I advise you, embracer of the voluptuous woman. Take this advice. Enjoy it if you grasp it. It will do you good if you get it. Never laugh at the ancient sage. Often it is good what the old ones say. Often from the wizened old body wise speech issues. They that hang among leathers and hide between hides. Håvamål, the speech of the High One, stanza 134, the Poetic Edda. Chapter 1:1, the Forgotten Manuscript, Poetic Edda. It is the year 1643 AD, and we find ourselves on an unknown Icelandic farm. The Bishop of Iceland, Brynjolf Sveinsson, has just received into his hands an ancient leather manuscript. He is told that the farmer's family has kept this manuscript safe for quite some time now. In fact, the manuscript has been hidden away from the public throughout a period of 400 years. Kept in the family or something for 400 years, hidden. Hidden away almost since it was first written down during the late 1100s. Copied from an even earlier manuscript, long lost. So this is the thing, the manuscripts that we have, most of them date back to the 12th, 13th, even the 14th centuries. That would be the equivalent of the 1100s, the 1200s and the 1300s after Christianity was introduced. But many of them base themselves off even older texts that got lost in fires and stuff. People knew that, so I know that in the medieval times they would keep these manuscripts in fireproof earth cellars in order to protect them from fire, because things got lost. There was lots and lots of material, lots and lots of manuscripts lying around in monasteries and with private people who had commissioned the work. The usual thing was to get a skald, actually, like Snorri Sturluson was actually a skald. He knew thousands and thousands of verses and poems by heart, and sagas. He knew all that inside his head. He could read and write, but he wasn't a writer. He was an oral transmitter of Old Norse lore, actually. And he actually he hired some scribes from the local monastery, paid them to write these things down, while he would be orally transmitting it as he would be to any audience at the time, and these scribes were writing it down. And this probably happened before too, so we have real skaldir, poets from these old traditions who were actually performing their art while scribes were writing it down. because the Icelanders back at this time, they thought it was very important to save, to preserve these cultures. And these first writings, they could be as well the first church, first monasteries in Iceland. I'm not sure when, but they would probably have been there already from the year 1000. So, yeah. So during the 11th centuries, many things were written down and then they were copied later. And usually what we get are the later copies because these first ones disappeared eventually. So anyway, this particular manuscript had been copied from an earlier manuscript, but it was still very early. It was still from the 1100s, the late 1100s. And you know what? Paganism wasn't actually outlawed in Iceland until about 1100. So these people had grandparents and great-grandparents who could still have been pagans. Because people were allowed to be pagan for about 100 years after the official conversion in Iceland. So this bishop, Brynjolf, the year 1643, slowly turns the pages made out of hide. Hang among leathers, hide between hides. He turns the pages made out of hide and realizes that, wow, an ancestral treasure has been recovered. A cultural heritage thought lost had been recovered. Ancient legends and myths speak out from the leathery pages through the almost forgotten language of poetical metaphors. Most of the poems in the manuscript had been lost, only sometimes referred to, and some stanzas quoted 400 years earlier by authors such as Snorri Sturluson, whose works had survived. This was the first time in several centuries that Snorri's main source to his prose Edda, the source that we know as the Elder Edda or the Poetic Edda, well, it had suddenly, after centuries of disappearance, been returned to the general public. This is amazing, actually, because there were lots of... This was copied from an earlier manuscript, and there had been lots of manuscripts copied, and they had all been lost. They just had a few sheets and a few references and quotes. Snorri Sturluson was probably the most important person to preserve Edda poetry because he quoted it a lot. But apart from his quotes and apart from a few pages here and there, they didn't have all the... they had thought that these Edda poems were lost, and now they returned because one family of farmers, mysterious family, had actually kept this book at home and guarded it. So, and why? Had the book been safeguarded against hostile church authorities? Was it released now that the guardians of the book realized that it could finally be safe to show it again? Because in 1643, paganism was no more a threat. It wasn't there was no competition between the religions anymore. So it would no longer be regarded as a threat to a new and fragile faith as it might have been before, which might be the reason why they actually chose to hide it. Or was it just a coincidence? A family treasure forgotten for some 4 centuries until it occurred to some bright person that other people might like to know this book too. It is hard to say, but it is an interesting and true story. So we know this hidden and now recovered manuscript as the Poetic Edda. So, what do we actually know about authentic Old Norse pagan mythology? Hardly anything at all, it could be argued. All the sources on Norse mythology and cosmology are written sources, written in the Old Norse language, yet in the Latin alphabet by scholars and monks more than a century or so after the conversion. And we just do not know to what degree accurate pagan myths survived in the memories of Christian descendants across several generations. Another question is how accurate any myth would be in the first place, since the pagan religion was not a dogmatic religion basing itself on the interpretation of holy books. It wasn't. It was a religion that based itself on magical activities and rituals and mystical experience. And myths may have varied according to who related them and when they related them and to who they related them and where and with what purpose. Poetry was a sacred art in Norse paganism, and poets could take great liberty and apply endless variety in their use of allegory and metaphor in order to convey a message. What we are left with are two main sources. The most important is the Poetic Edda, also known as the Elder Edda. And the Poetic Edda is a sort of umbrella term for Edda poetry, that is poems that were composed in a particular style, the Edda style. The Poetic Edda is now a collection of poems that are recognized as belonging to the Edda style, the Edda traditions. And the Old Norse word Edda means great grandmother. So it refers to the lore of the ancestors, or more literally, the ancestral mothers. The feminine is probably used here because lore and stories were in themselves feminine concepts in the Norse language, as we can see in the feminine word saga, which means story. And so if you had a thing that had a feminine gender in the language, you would refer to it by feminine terms. So Edda, great grandmother. But it just means the lore of the old people, the people who came before. Most of the Edda poems that we know of were collected in the manuscript that I talked about before. Most of the Edda poems, not all. There are some other sheets of leather or a book, or even a book, where some Edda poems that have been preserved. But most of them were collected in this manuscript that we know as the Codex Regius, the royal codex. Which resurfaced in 1643 after having been kept away from the public for a period of 4 centuries. So as mentioned before, an Icelandic family of farmers had been the keepers of the only comprehensive collection of Edda poems that had survived what may have been the censorship of a medieval church. Could be. Quite reasonable to think so, I think. So this leather manuscript was almost complete, with the exception of a few pages that had been torn out in the end, sadly. Some of the poems in this manuscript were already known from other papers dating back to the 12th and 13th centuries. Some other Edda poems have been preserved in other places, often through copying, so that some poems are given a very late date, because the only source that we have to it was written down at a later stage. But these sources did copy from older sources, as I told you about before. The poem itself may be far older. The earliest transcriptions are lost, and they may have been composed by skalds who lived actually during the pre-Christian era too. So some scholars are very cautious about using poems that were written down even later than the Codex Regius, which was written down during the early 12th century and probably copied from an older source still. Well, they are cautious about using these because they may have been invented. That is at least the argument. Maybe some of these poems were invented by medieval scholars rather than by pagan poets. Thus, many poems such as the Groa Galder, the Fjørdsvinds Mål, Rafna Galder Odins, and the Solar Ljod, which I have translated as the spell of growth, or a spell song to grow, the speech of much knowing, Odin's raven spell, and the song of the sun. Well, these are often left out of modern collections and translations because they are found in very late sources only. They were not there in the codex regius. However, these poems are still called Edda poems because they do fit into the category of Edda lore. And in my opinion, an analysis of the structure and the symbolic details within the poems will show that these poems belong to an actual pagan or pre-Christian tradition in Scandinavia, because they resemble and fall into a thoroughly pagan worldview and convey pagan concerns, as I will be arguing throughout the whole book. The Song of the Sun is, however, one of the poems that clearly reveal a conflict between the old religion and the new Christian one. I'll get back to that later. One of my major arguments concerning most of the Edda poems, whether they were collected in the Codex Regius or not, is that they follow a basic structure of initiation, or else refer to concepts and practices which cannot have emerged in or been practiced legally during the Christian era. I repeat, they refer to events and happenings and concepts that cannot have a Christian origin at all. For the sake of simplicity, I will refer to the Edda poems as such as the Poetic Edda, despite the fact that no such book really exists, since the Codex Regius manuscript did not contain all the Edda poems. Instead, I will use my conclusion as a starting point, which is that the Poetic Edda represents lore that emerged in an Old Norse pagan environment. One important aspect of the Poetic Edda is that the poems, like all Old Norse poetry, are based on allusive metaphors and allegory. A character or theme will never be directly identified, only alluded to indirectly through metaphor, so that each line of the poem becomes a riddle that has to be solved. Each line. The poet at that time, the skald back then, expected his listeners to decipher the meaning based on their knowledge on mythical cosmology and pseudo-history. To modern people, this task becomes very challenging, as we no longer know the entirety of the pagan worldview. We don't. So we must make do with the limited access we have, mainly through Snorri's prose Edda and a few other sources. We do, for example, face a lot of challenges when we read Old Norse poems, because often the poems are at odds with our preconceived ideas of the Old Norse pantheon and cosmology. Most of our preconceived ideas are derived from secondary textbooks about Norse myths. What we learned through media and through education and from Snorri's prose Edda. All these books, including Snorri's text, do present a simplified overview of Norse mythology that often skip important details for the sake of making the myths appear more straightforward and simple than they really are. I am often faced with reactions from my audience when I refer to information that is usually not acknowledged in mainstream media, I wrote, but which is known to those of us who actually study the primary sources. So let me use a stanza from the poem Solarljod, the Song of the Sun, stanza 79, to illustrate my point. Här runar ristigt hafa, njardar däter nio. Rådväg hin äldsta, och kreppvör hin yngsta, och deras syster sjau. Translation. Here are runes that have been carved by the 9 daughters of Njord. Council drink, Rådväg. Council drink the oldest, approaching spring the youngest, and their 7 sisters. So if you already possess some general knowledge on Old Norse myths, you may react to these lines, like I once did myself, with the objection, but Njord did not have 9 daughters. He had just one, Freyja, and a son, Freyr. And you would not be the only one. Due to these kinds of preconceptions that we have from secondary textbooks, modern scholars have had the audacity to completely ignore information given in this Edda poem, namely that Njord had 9 daughters. And moreover, that these daughters are carving runes in the underworld, quite exactly like the Nornir, the goddesses of fate. So this information is dismissed as just another example of how this particular Edda poem must be read as a late Christian misrepresentation of Norse pagan mythology, or Norse pagan cosmology. And by missing out on this important bit of information, we are also missing out on a very important piece of an often ignored yet crucial part of Old Norse cosmology, that of the 9 giantesses who gave birth to the universe. And I will be returning to this concept throughout this book. I will say that such an attitude that we have to dismiss this particular Edda poem. Well, that's a very arrogant attitude. We, 1,000 years later, cannot claim to know more about Norse pagan cosmology than the people who clearly lived through the phase of transition between the old and the new religion, which the poet obviously did. The poet who created the Song of the Sun was clearly in some agony over the conflicting worldviews, and is repeatedly referring to pagan concepts of the soul and the afterlife. Did he really know so little about the pagan religion that he would make obvious mistakes? Or did he refer to concepts that were still common knowledge and that would be understood by his audience? When Snorri wrote his prose Edda in the 1220s, he did so because he says this, he writes this right there in his book, he says that young people, this is the 1220s, 220 years after the official conversion and 120 years after the official outlawing of paganism, he wrote that young people in the 1220s were beginning to forget. So yeah, he did so because he perceived that young people were beginning to forget the myths of their ancestors. he writes this. He is an old man then, and he is looking around him and noticing that, wow, all these young people, they don't know the lore anymore. Just like I today can look at young people and like, wow, these young people, they don't know what it's like to live without a mobile phone. So obviously he grew up with a living tradition that still existed, that might have changed, but it was still a direct anchor back into pre-Christian times. And now finally, after a couple of 100 years, young people were beginning to forget the Old Norse myths, the pagan myths, the pre-Christian lore. So in other words, it is very likely that the concepts that surface in Old Norse poetry, yet otherwise unknown to us from textbooks or Snorri's work, well, they are addressing and referring to actual pagan concepts that were in fact known by those who listened to the art of the poetry. All right, I have been reading for an hour now. I'm gonna just look if there are any questions. I have set this last hour apart to answer questions, but I cannot see. I can see some hellos here. Hello. Yeah, I said hello to you, Laura and Eric. Thank you for watching. Well, you can type something in here if you want to ask any questions. Otherwise, I might just start. I just continue reading for a while. All right. Now I got to a part where it says a list of Edda poems. Okay, I'm sorry, I had to use the glasses. A list of Edda poems, and I'm actually going through every poem with a summary. It's several pages. I'll probably just use the whole hour or more just reading through all these summaries. I'm not sure if you want me to do that or just move on, because we talked a lot about Edda poetry. I am pretty sure I can just skip this part of summaries of each and every poem, because there are lots and lots of pages. Unless you object. I'll take that as a no, not objection. And I move on to 1-2, Snorri Sturluson. So, apart from the Poetic Edda, our most important source to Old Norse myths was written down by the Icelandic scholar. I've heard someone say that he was a bishop or that he was a priest, but he wasn't. He was not a priest. He was not clergy. He was a scholar, a learned man, and a chief, a political voice in Iceland at his time. He was born in 1179 and died in 1241. So his work on mythology was one of his last works. And I said, Snorri Sturluson did not write down these things himself. He was a skald belonging to the tradition of skaldic or skaldic poetry. And he knew hundreds of poems and thousands, literally thousands of verses in his mind. He knew this tradition. He was a part of this tradition. And he hired monks or people who, or monks and clergy, people from the local monastery, to sit down and write down while he actually transmitted this orally. So, Snorri's work is usually known as the Prose Edda and is divided into separate books, which should be called treatises about Old Norse poetry. In fact, the entire work is a treatise on pagan poetry, a dissertation, a study, an attempt to explain pagan poetry. the ancient art of bards or skalds, known in Old Norse as skaldskap, which means the creation of the bard, creation of poetry. Snorri had a clear and outspoken agenda with his work. His agenda, and he writes, his scribes wrote this down. He says that he realized that people were beginning to forget the myths of their ancestors. As a good Christian, he could not really defend his wish to preserve these pagan myths. But as a poet and a scholar of poetry, he could claim the importance of the myths as the basis of the ancient art of poetry. Because since Old Norse poetry was based on metaphor, and the metaphors drew from mythology, it was necessary to remember Old Norse mythology just in order to understand and continue the ancient and precious art of poetry that he had dedicated his life to know. So Snorri's Prose Edda, then, was an attempt to preserve the very special Norse art of metaphorical poetry by writing down the most important myths that would explain these metaphors. That's what his book is really about. It's not just a story about myths, it's an attempt to explain metaphors. It's a teaching book for young skalds, for young poets. Without knowledge of the myths, it would soon be impossible to understand the poetry of the ancestors. In fact, without the aid of Snorri's marvelous work, without Snorri's marvelous work, he was a great storyteller too, and it's really subtle, his book, really sublime. People don't get that often, but it is, I promise. Without the aid of Snorri's marvelous work today, we would not be able to understand neither Skaldic nor Edda poetry. We wouldn't. It would just sound meaningless to us. The verses would have appeared unintelligible to us because they were created as they are in a language of riddles, allegories, and metaphors. The various parts of the Prose Edda are as follows. It begins with a prologue, prologus. In Latin, they didn't have a word for prologus, prologue. So in his prologus, Snorri makes an effort to present the pagan gods as ancestors, human ancestors, who had been so marvelous and powerful that their descendants, in their superstitious ignorance, started to worship them as gods after their deaths. So Snorri explained that the term Aesir, which means gods, really meant Asians, a name derived from the fact, in his mind, that the Aesir originated in Turkey, or to be more exact, in the famous Troy. Troy and Turkey belonged to the Asian continent as far as Snorri and his contemporaries were concerned. So this historical approach is usually dismissed as a fancy of Snorri's, who was supposedly trying to establish an ancestral line to the classical world, which was quite fashionable in 13th century Europe. However, there are aspects of the story which, in my opinion, curiously resemble very early movements from the southeast to the northwest towards the end of the Stone Age, or aspects that I will be exploring in later chapters. Also, the idea of ancestral worship is by no means unknown from other Viking Age sources, and it is not impossible that the term Aesir is related to the old Gothic term Ancestral, which means ancestors. And the Aesir, the ancestors, were indeed worshipped by the Goths. So whether there is any truth in Snorri's tales, and if so, to what degree, well, that is difficult to say. But we must not forget that Snorri's representation of the pagan gods as human ancestors was a very clever move. Because remember that the other manuscript, the poems, well, they were sort of hidden away. And most of them were lost or destroyed. So Snorri had to be a bit careful with what he wrote. We don't know. Everybody said he was a Christian. Everybody who wrote anything back then in the 12th century, they were in Europe, they were Christians. All the sources, all the written resources we have were written down by people who were Christians, because no matter what they thought inside their heads, they had no other option. It was illegal to be anything else. You could be ruined if you were not a Christian. So officially everybody, including Snorri, were Christians. But what Snorri did to save these stories was to sort of make them less dangerous to the church. So by representing the pagan gods as human ancestors, he made a very clever move. He let the Christian authorities and the Christian audience understand that these were really just tales of famous humans in the past. And thus the myths no longer posed a threat to Christian doctrine. He made sure to preserve these myths, or the stories that we would need in order to understand the poetry. And he did that. He safeguarded these myths by making the gods less dangerous, because they were not gods competing with the Christian gods anymore. They were just humans. And then we could tell their stories. Clever. The church could certainly accept ancestral history where it could not accept pagan beliefs. It is almost certain that this prologus saved the Prose Edda from the oblivion that was imposed on the Poetic Edda. Snorri simply made the myths acceptable to the church, and it is not unlikely that this was a conscious effort, a way of actually preserving these myths. So, thank Snorri for what he did. Without his work, we would not understand much of the poetry left to us. So, the first book of the Prose Edda is Gylfaginning. And that is a treatise which means the revelations of, or the visions, or the hallucinations of the sorcerer. And I will describe this work more thoroughly in chapter 1-3. Now, the second book of the Prose Edda, Skaldskaparmál, well, this is a treatise that means the speech of the creation of poetry. And I will discuss this more thoroughly in chapter 1-4. Then, the third and last part of the book is Hottatal. So, and this means the list of verses, and it's a systematized textbook about the rules of Old Norse poetry, using poetical examples, usually created by Snorri himself, so he managed to preserve a bit of his own poetry too. Then, another important source to mythology, also written by Snorri Sturluson, is the Ynglinga saga, which means the saga of Yng's descendants. And this work is the first part of the greater work Heimskringla, which means the world circle, which was a collection of sagas about the Norwegian kings by Snorri Sturluson. So in the first part of his Ynglinga saga, Snorri elaborates the same story told in his prose Edda prologue, namely where he points out the origin of the Aesir as ancestors from the south. The saga is loosely based on several skaldic poems, in particular the skaldic poem Ynglinga. And Ynglinga was a skaldic poem that Snorri preserved for us. It was first composed sometime towards the end of the 800s. That's deep Viking Age. That's early Viking Age. Oh, well, not early, late, deep, middle. That's pre-Christian. That is as pre-Christian as it gets. It was composed by a skald who lived then, Tjodolfr the Wise. Other famous Viking Age skalds are also referred to and quoted, revealing a lore where various royal lines were indeed thought to be descendants of divine beings. So here we have actually proof that people back in pre-Christian times and the Viking Age, the people who actually composed these poems, they also believed that the gods had come down somehow to earth and been the progenitors of royal dynasties. It was a way of legitimizing power, of course, to say that my royal lineage descends from Odin. My one mine descends from Freyr. But they believed that. They did believe that the gods had actually been down on earth and walked among people. Snorri sort of said that they were only humans, while in pagan times we must assume that they believed that the gods had incarnated in human form at some time in order to create these royal lineages. So, let's see. Yeah. In Norway, several noble and royal clans claimed to be descendants of the mountain hunter and skiing goddess Underdis, Skadi. Well, she was a giantess, but also referred to as a goddess, and her marriage to Odin. And this is very old lore, so if you just start objecting again, that's what, Skadi wasn't married to Odin, Skadi was married to Njord. Yeah, there is a myth where Skadi is married to Njord, and then she decides that she doesn't want to have any, well, she doesn't want him anymore. And she leaves. And then she goes on and becomes one of the several wives of Odin. And she also had something with Loki, so yeah. Anyway, in Norway, claiming descendants from Skadi and Odin was very fancy. Maybe from Skadi and Njord too, I don't know. We only know about the Skadi and Odin part. But they were the mythical origins of several Norwegian royal dynasties. And in Sweden, we had similar things. In Sweden, we have the Ynglinga line, who claim descent from Freyr and his marriage to another giantess, Gerdir. And in other sources we know that in Norway it was quite common to believe that we all descended from giants, the Jötnar. They were actually the first Norwegians in some other, not Snorri, but other stories. They emphasize actually marriages between human beings and giants, giantesses and giants. So, lesser known, but true. And in Denmark, I know that there was at least one, probably several, but especially one royal dynasty, the Skjöldungar. In Beowulf, you know this in English as the Skylfings, I think. Yeah, they descended from Odin as well, from his son Skjold, who got married to Gefjon, which means the provider, and she was a goddess. So it was common back then to actually believe that human beings could be descended from both gods and giants, and elves too. We have that too in many stories. So these separate borders between the species or the races, well, they didn't have them, basically. Studies initiated by the Norwegian academic authority Gro Steinsland have shown that this kind of noble descent from a sacred marriage between a god and a giantess, usually, sometimes a goddess, was extremely important in the lore and religious life of the Vikings. I noticed that I have kept using the term Vikings. Back then, I would not have done that anymore, because as many have pointed out, Viking was not actually a description of a culture at all. It was just it was a profession. It meant pirate, and in the sagas we find numerous examples of how other people from completely different countries are also called Vikings because they are pirates. So Viking is pirate. It has nothing to do with where you were from. But well, I'm reading from a book written back 10 years ago, and I did use the term Viking because it was, well, it was common, basically. So, in the Ynglinga saga, Snorri emphasized the role of the Aesir gods and goddesses as powerful priests, godir, and priestesses, Gylfaginning, who established the Norse religion in a distant past. Odin, in particular, was a powerful sorcerer who performed marvelous feats, which was why he was worshipped after his death, according to Ynglinga saga. And Freyr was remembered and worshipped as a great king, and Freya, who introduced the art of cider to the Aesir, to the gods. Well, she was the last living and only surviving member of the ancestral pantheon, according to Snorri. According to Snorri, Freya still lived in the 1220s. Snorri said that she still operates as a temple priestess, a blodgudja, even to this day, which would be the early 13th century. So scholars have suggested that what Snorri was really referring to was the possible fact that the worship of and divine attribution and private rituals associated with Freya were the last part of the pagan religion to survive into the 13th centuries. It is possible, we don't know, but according to Snorri, Freya was the only one among the Aesir who still lived. Could have something to do with possibly it could have something to do with Snorri having understood what I at some point also understood, namely that the gods, the male gods, they are actually not immortal. They are completely dependent on these apples of immortality or regeneration, really, because it's not enough to just get the apple once. You have to get it again and again. You have to be regenerated again and again to become a god. And these were given by the goddess. We also hear that the gods are destined to die during Ragnarök, and that their children will take over, but nothing is said of the goddesses dying. So, and it is a goddess who is the actual provider of immortality or this regeneration. So maybe it was just that the goddess was the only immortal among the gods, possibly. Yeah. Another interesting part of the Ynglinga saga is the prologue, where Snorri refers to his sources and discusses their credibility. So this is very modern for us to see someone in the Middle Ages explaining their sources, and even having something that we today call source criticism. That is quite interesting. So I'm going to read what this great scholar wrote. In this book, I let write down old rumors of the chiefs who had their reigns in the northern lands, and who have spoken Norse languages, like Norrøna. Such as I have heard wise men tell. He has heard wise men tell. He's a part of a living oral transmission culture still. Some of this is found in the stories of the lineages which kings and other nobles count their descent after. That would be the skaldic poetry about divine descent. Some is also written after old songs that people use for entertainment. For even if we do not know if these are true, there is evidence that old wise men have thought them to be true. Tjodolfr the Wise from Kvilhaug was a skald at the court of Harald Hårfagre. Harald Hårfagre, he lived between 850 and 932. And he made that poem known as the Ynglinga. While Harald Hårfagre was the king of Norway, Iceland was settled mostly by people who refused to bow to Harald's brutal sole reign. That was my comment. At Harald's court, there were many skalds, and people still know their songs and the songs about all the kings who have ruled in Norway since. And we have gathered most of our knowledge from what has been told in the poems sung for the kings themselves, or for their sons. It is the way of skalds to praise most the man in front of whom they are performing, of course, but no one would dare to tell a man about deeds he was supposed to have done, when everyone who listened knew them to be lies and bragging, and he himself as well. That would have been scorn, not praise. So what Snorri is trying to point out here is that the poems composed by the skaldir, they were performed before the people they were about very often. And obviously you couldn't just present sheer lies, because people would know that it was a lie and they would be ridiculed. So these stories, even if they're praising someone above others, they're still not factually wrong. They couldn't be. So I continue. Ari, priest the wise, was the first man here in the land, that would be Iceland, who wrote in the Norse language the knowledge of old and new times. Ari also learned a lot from Turid, the daughter of Snorri, the pagan priest. She was a wise woman, and she remembered Snorri, her father, and he was about 35 years old when Christianity came to Iceland. It was not so strange that Ari had good knowledge about ancient events both here and in other countries, when he learned from such knowledgeable people, and he himself was knowledge hungry and had a good memory. So basically, Snorri is basing himself a lot on writings by the first person in Iceland who actually wrote in the Old Norse language. He used Latin. He was the first to use Latin letters and tried to put them down in his own language, which was during the 1100s. So, 1100s, Ari, priest the wise, learned from Turid, who learned from her father, Snorri, who had been 35 years old in the year 1000. And this Snorri, he was a pagan priest, so he would know a lot about religion and about these old things. So Snorri is trying to point out that he is actually basing himself on accounts that are based on accounts by that are based on accounts again by people who are actually pagans. That's what he's trying to say here, who actually lived back then. And he says, however, despite using these oral sources and these old written sources based on oral sources, he says, however, I think that the poems, the skaldic poems, are the least misleading ones if they are sung properly and interpreted with wisdom. The thing about skaldic poetry, and Snorri did a great job in preserving these for us, is that they are composed in what we call a bound form, a linguistically bound form. That means that you can't actually change them on the way. Edda poetry is slightly less bound, so Edda poetry could have been changed, tampered with, but the skaldic poems, the skaldic poems that we read today, they were actually composed in their present form during the pre-Christian era. And he, as Snorri points out, these are the best sources. These are contemporary sources. These gives us an actual eye into that time. And some of them are about mythology. A few of them. Now, I'm going to look. Hello. Do you have any questions yet? Or, let's see, still got 20 minutes. I could read to you about Gylfaginning and Skaldskaparmál. Alright, I will. Chapter 1-3, Gylfaginning, the revelations of the sorcerer. Now, in Gylfaginning, the first part of the Prose Edda, Gylfi was a name of a Swedish sorcerer king who went to seek Åsgarder, the abode of the Aesir, usually translated as gods. Although the Aesir were but one tribe of so-called Mottugar, powers, in which the Old Norse pagans believed and related to. According to Snorri, the Aesir were Asians who had arrived in Scandinavia in the old days. In the Gylfaginning, the Aesir had reached Sweden, and they were in constant war with a native, powerful sorcerer king, Gylfi. So when I first tried to look up the meaning of the name Gylfi, I only found one dictionary dating back to 1886 by Johan Fritzner. It's in Norwegian, Ordbok over det gamle norske språk. That's a dictionary, Old Norse dictionary. And this very, very old dictionary actually offered a translation and interpretation even. And this provides a very interesting clue. It is literally said that Gylfi refers to a werewolf, a shape changer, or, most remarkably, a sorcerer who changes into a woman every ninth night. So every ninth night, this sorcerer assumes the shape of a woman, and nothing more. So the true meaning of this name is lost in a world view that is so different from our own that we would be hard put to explain it any further. And I haven't found any interpretation in any later dictionary that I have looked at. Only in Johan Fritzner 1886 original version of Ordbok over det gamle norske språk. And this I found in the National Library of Norway in Oslo. And it actually said that a Gylfi refers to a werewolf, shape changer, or a sorcerer who changes into a woman every ninth night. So I can only point out the obvious, that the concept of changing sex, whether in real life or symbolically, was indeed associated with sorcery, and that the number 9 is a significant number in Norse mythology as a whole. The allusion to a sex change every 9 nights is laden with symbolism regarding the number 9 and the transformation issues associated with this number. And I'm going to read up some points where transformation issues are associated with the number 9. 1. The precious ring, Draupnir, exists in Norse myth. It drips 8 new rings every 9th night. And this is the ring that burned with Balder on the funeral pyre, and which was returned to Odin after a journey to Hel, which was when the hero Hermod went down into Hel and got this ring back from Balder and returned it to Odin. He survived death. 9 is also the number of nights that Odin hung on the tree during his initiation, and then he transformed too. Not into a woman, but into a wise man. It is also the number of nights it takes to reach the heart of Hel, the heart of death, according to the story of Hermod, who attempted to save Balder. And 9 is the number of nights that Freyr must wait before he can unite with his lover, and is the number of Freya's heaven, where she receives the chosen dead. A lot about death here. 9 is the number of worlds in which Hel rules, maybe mortal world in which death rules, basically. The Valkyriur of the Edda, who will bring you after your death again, will transform you into a Einherj. Well, these Valkyriur also appear in groups of 9. And we have learned from Adam of Bremen that the famous hanging sacrifice at Uppsala involved 9 men being sacrificed over the course of 9 days. And we learned that 9 mothers gave birth to the great Heimdallr, whose name literally means the great dazzling world. So there are 9 worlds before the present world, and some sources declare that a human being has 9 Fylgjur. That means followers, like female guardian spirits and souls, possibly souls also of ancestral mothers who will protect their living descendants and guide the dead to their afterlife home, death again. So all these associations are significant, but we are still left dangling, knowing only that Gylfi is associated with magic, shape-changing, gender-bending, and the very important number 9, which has to do with death, initiation, and creation, not the least the creation of a new cycle. The other word that composes the title Gylfaginning. Gylfa is the genitive form of Gylfi, so it means Gylfis, the sorceress. Well, the other word that composes the title Gylfaginning is ginning, which means illusion, hallucination, optical trickery, or vision, as in revelation, perhaps, which the story also turns out to be, a revelation. So in my opinion, the most correct interpretation of the title of Snorri's first book would translate something like the revelation of the sorcerer. And in the revelation of the sorcerer, Gylfi is inspired by the powerful deeds and cunning of the goddess Gefjon. Her name means provider and is also actually a name for Freya. So they could be the same. And Gefjon knows all fate and is the first among the Aesir who manages to trick the sorcerer king completely. So because of her, the Aesir are having trouble. They are having trouble taking the power from Gylfi, but she manages. And this feat of the Åsynja, the goddess of Aesir stock, this feat of the Åsynja makes Gylfi very curious and spurs him to travel to the Aesir's abode, that is, to Åsgarder and Valhöll. And on his journey to the divine world, he takes the name Gangleri. That means wandering learner. He seems conspicuously like the god Odin himself, a sorcerer and a shape changer, who has also certainly taken the shape of a woman sometimes, and who frequently moves into the various dimensions of the universe in order to learn ever more and more, and he who takes upon himself countless names. Indeed, Gangleri is listed among the more important names of Odin. According to the rules of Norse poetry, characters will be hidden in words and identify themselves through attributes such as these. The riddle is presented. How come Odin is in fact visiting his own abode, seeking himself as if he was a stranger from a different land? Has it anything to do with the name he uses when he begins his quest, the wandering learner? When the wandering learner arrives in Åsgarder, he encounters another aspect of the god Odin, a threefold, a trinity aspect, disguised in three shapes: Hår, Jafnhår, and Thridi, which means the high one, just as high, and third. And these are all names of Odin. And these three different versions of Odin, they take turns in answering Gylfi's questions about the universe, telling Gylfi all about the history of the world from beginning to end. Most of the revelations are based on the Edda poem Völuspa, but they also take references from other cosmological Edda poems, especially Grimnismal and Vafthrudnismal, which means the speech of the masked one, and the speech of the very powerful Hedvil. So, when the three have finished their revelations, the whole of Åsgarder, the whole of the divine world, vanishes into thin air. And it turns out that the entire experience had been a ginning, an illusion, a hallucination, a trick, or indeed a sorcerer's visionary revelation. Gylfi finds himself on an empty field. An interesting feature that we will return to later is the fact that after this, Gylfi starts to walk through the world, telling people everything that he had heard while in this state or in this place that vanished. And one after the other, people retold the stories. And then, and it is pointed out that only then did these stories actually become real. As Snorri mysteriously concludes. And they, the gods, recalled the things that they had told the visitor, and to the people and places that were there, they gave the same names as in their stories, so that people, when great spans of time were gone, should not know that they were the same Aesir, those that they had just made up, and whom they now gave the same names. it was only then that Thor got his name. That the world itself, because that's the story that's being told, the world story, that the world itself was considered a great story told by the gods and then retold by the living, is a concept that is often hinted at in Old Norse sources. It's like the world is a tale, and it is only becoming true when these tales are retold. Mysterious. Such a concept of the world as a tale may very well have been part of the esoteric mysteries revealed through poetry. It is certainly not unknown from other cultures either. According to Joseph Campbell, the mythic image, a Kalahari bushman was known to have claimed that there is a dream dreaming us. And according to the Indian epic Yoga Vashishta 2.3.11, the world is like the impression left by the telling of a story. So that the greatest creator god was the inventor of poetry is no coincidence. Neither that his very name, Odin, indicates that he is, in fact, the poetry. Because that's what Odin means, the, Oder, the poetry. Neither is it a coincidence that one of the names of his fate-knowing wife, Frigg, is saga, which means the story. Alright, it's almost 9 o'clock, so I'm gonna have to finish now. We're gonna continue next Sunday. And I'm gonna continue with 1.4 Skaldskaparmál. About the speech of the creation of poetry and hidden meanings in poetical metaphors. And I'll just read, just to close up here, I'm just gonna read a quote from Snorri Sturluson in his introduction to the Prose Edda. I wrote this book so that young students of poetry could learn to decipher that which has been composed in a subtle manner. Thank you for today. All right. Oh, thank you. Hi, hello, Conrad. Thank you. I can take off my glasses now so you can see me. There's a lot of shine in the glasses, but I'm sorry, I have to do that. I'm 47 soon, so I'll have to. I hope you enjoyed this. I don't see any actual questions yet, and that's fine. I'm really happy to see you here, and I will continue next Sunday, and I will post this this video on my Patreon for everybody too. So, okay. Good night. Bye bye.